Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Vergel Koji processed Colombia from Sweven Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Sweven, based out of Bristol, England, and they were a suggestion to us by Yokata. So shoutouts to and thank you to Yokata for the suggestion. Sweven is one of many English coffee roasters currently on our viewer subscriber recommendation suggestion list that do not ship to the United States. So we are very fortunate to see the Right Roast offering them as part of their New Kids on the Blog subscription sets this past month. And as a result, of course, I snatched this coffee up as soon as I could. And it's a coffee that I'm looking forward to reviewing for both that reason and the fact that it is a Koji processed coffee. And the Koji processing method has become a lot more popular within the past year or so. Even Manhattan was offering a couple of Koji processed coffees that sold out very quick. And it's something I've never tried before, so I definitely wanted to at least get some familiarity with this processing method. So looking forward to discussing this coffee, as this right here is day 27. And recipe the Right Roast has for this coffee is a about 16.8 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, so about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I definitely like this coffee a lot better through the V60, which would indicate a more medium fine grind. As far as roast profile goes, I mean, it's extremely tricky between the unique processing method and the fact that it's an English coffee. So I think the best I can say is that this is lighter than most English coffees I've had, and that's just kind of the way we'll go with for this review. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and I was noticing a fair bit of funkiness right from the start. And I've kind of alluded to this in previous videos that early stage anaerobics came out a lot more funky than boozy, and that's kind of how I became initially familiarized with the anaerobic processing method. So I actually do slightly prefer funky to boozy because boozy has just become a little too common and a little too overbearing with so many coffees in general. So it was better in that sense, but it was such a wildly funky stone fruit. It reminded me of some El Paraíso coffees I'd had, anaerobic ones, very early when they first started being released. And as a result, it wasn't necessarily my favorite first impression, but there was still some potential to work with on this coffee. Day 16, ran it through the V60, and the coffee felt a little bit more English, and that's what I'm kind of alluding to in terms of the roast profile, as there was a slight bit of that kind of English roastiness. That's quite common in almost all English coffees that I do drink, and as a result, it just felt slightly more developed than I think I was anticipating. I don't think that a higher concentration necessarily did this coffee too much justice, because these early stages we were brewing with our standard recipe, the 16 to 1, and I wasn't necessarily getting the best results at it. It had somewhat of a kind of vegetal herbal aspect to it, in addition to that very strong, funky stone fruit candy. So still not necessarily the best, and we continue on as day 19. We adjusted to the recipe that the Right Roast had, and this was definitely better, which is a lot more diluted of a recipe, and the coffee both felt thinner and a little bit more diluted, which definitely helped it in general, as it just kind of toned down all of those maybe stronger fermenty aspects that we were experiencing, and it was a little bit more funky, and at this time it was a little boozy. It was reminding me a lot of that coffee we reviewed from the process, which I believe was, it was some sort of unique processed Colombian coffee too. And these unique processed Colombian coffees are just, they're interesting to say the least. So day 19 wasn't necessarily the best impression either. It reminded me a lot of a tropical cocktail essentially. Day 21, coffee seems to be improving a little bit. So a little bit of the booziness has dissipated slightly, and the wildly vibrant tropical fruit forward cup is a little bit more prominent in this sense, which is better. Essentially a bit of a fruit cocktail cup with a kind of syrupy aspect to the coffee, especially as it has cooled down. It's still a little heavy, but I'm starting to see some improvement. Day 22, back through the Chemex for the first time, and it was working a little bit better, but I think that there are very few coffees I see such a stark contrast and difference with just how much better one brew method is over the other, because while there was improvement from the Chemex in the early stages I had experienced this coffee, it still was not nearly as good as it was through the V60. It feels relatively clean compared to what I've experienced from a lot of these heavy processed coffees, so that was definitely worth noting on this day. Coffee slowly seems to be improving. I would say a lot more of this kind of pineapple bitterness was coming from this coffee today. Plenty still of that stone fruit mango, that kind of funky mango, and in addition to that, yeah, the coffee has just seen nice improvement. Day 24, final notes I have, cleanest the cup of coffee has been to this point. So I'm starting to see a lot more clarity, and I think giving this coffee some rest has really let it settle a lot, because those really strong fermented aspects, both the slight booziness as well as the funkiness, has really kind of toned down and evened out a lot. As I'm drinking it on day 27, I ran it back through the Chemex, and that's why I've just kind of decided the V60 is a lot better for this coffee. A lot of the syrupiness is tapered off, skewing a bit more on that kind of pineapple-like citrus fruit aspect as opposed to the more funky mango, which is fine by me. And there's a little bit of this kind of grape hard candy to it as well, which will be charted in the tasting wheel. It offers plenty of sweetness and depth, but not in an overbearing sense. And that's going to be a perfect transition into this tasting wheel, because this way you can see what we were getting. I actually do not have the tasting wheel pulled up. Let me pull that up real quick. All right, and 5 level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. The finish, the sweetness, and the acidity. So, yeah, I actually agree with all of those. I think those are two really surprising things, both the finish and the sweetness, because in theory, this would be a very overbearing, long-lasting sweet cup of coffee, and as a result, I'm kind of surprised by seeing those both at a level 4, because it wasn't necessarily the case. I think the dilution of the recipe definitely helped in that sense, because on those kind of earlier days when we were brewing in a more concentrated recipe, I think it could have been justified, especially on the finish. But I like those both being at level 4. So that's off to a positive start for this tasting wheel. The citrus fruit and the stone fruit. The stone fruit, I think, throughout the duration of this coffee was the most pronounced thing, but towards the end it was skewing a little bit more towards the citric aspect for me, so that's justified there. And the acidity, especially when brewed through the V60, I could definitely feel a fair bit of the acidity in the cup of coffee, which not necessarily a bad thing if it's balanced out by the sweetness. So for the most part, yeah, those at a level 4 I completely agree with, and I think that they're good at those marks. Maybe some slight bit of the sticking points is the bitterness at a level 3, because I kind of alluded to this, a little bit of a pineapple bitterness that I was experiencing from it. And yeah, a little bit of smokiness too. So those are maybe the slight grievances I have with this coffee. However, the most important thing I think we must discuss is the cleanliness at a level 3, because it is on the lower side of that level 3. But given exactly what this coffee is, that's the most impressive part of this coffee, is that it is as clean as it is. Almost all of these wild, funky, processed coffees, especially the Colombian coffees, almost always chart at a level 1, if I'm not being generous, to a lower side of level 2. But this one's so much cleaner than the rest of them. And it's not by any means close to being as clean as a wash processed coffee, and it's definitely on the lower side of the level 3. But hitting that level 3 mark for a processing method like this, in my opinion, is quite impressive. So that's the best part of this coffee, at least for me anyway. There's a fair bit of florals, kind of those herbal vegetable florals that I kind of mentioned throughout maybe some of the earlier stages. Still present in the cup, maybe not as pronounced as I was experiencing with more concentrated recipes. Lower body has to do probably with the lower concentration. Yeah, for the most part, I honestly don't think that there's anything else worth discussing or too much I would actually change on this tasting wheel in general. All right, my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I think it was a very sensitive one, because a lot of these notes are somewhat inconsistent because there were so many changes throughout the time drinking this coffee. But at that same stage, significant improvement, because the cup of coffee I was experiencing day 14 and day 16 is nowhere near as good as the coffee I was experiencing on day 24. So I was seeing marked improvement. I feel like maybe if I would wait another week or so, and I have a little bit left, I could run this one more time through the V60 and see if maybe even more of the kind of fermented aspect of this coffee has tapered off, because those fruits are funky, wild, and out there, and it's a very strong, sweet, interesting cup of coffee in general. I mean, it's a very vibrant cup of coffee, and I know a lot of people like that, so that transitions perfectly into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you really liked those strong fruits, most specifically that kind of stone citrus fruit that comes from those anaerobic coffees, but you don't necessarily enjoy the lack of clarity, this one is one of the cleanest versions of those coffees I've had, which is a huge positive for me, at least for what this coffee is. So I think that would be an ideal suggestion for somebody that's maybe been looking for a little bit more clarity in those coffees, because that was a nice selling point to me on this coffee, and as a result, I think it was a better than expected impression, especially from the early stages of when I started drinking this coffee. For the most part, I think I'll leave this review at that though. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, we'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it, or Sweven as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And this right here has been a review of the Vergel Koji Processed Colombia from Sweven Coffee. Thank you for watching.